Beneath the ashes of victory lie corridors no one dares to enter, sealed with silence and stamped with forgotten codenames. Whispers of weapons that never reached the battlefield, files erased before daylight could expose them, and voices recorded, only to vanish into concrete tombs. These are the shadows left behind, fragments of truth hidden not by accident, but by design. Step closer, and you'll hear what was never meant to survive the war. On January 24, 1945, as the Red Army advanced into East Prussia, units of the German 561st Volksgrenadier Division executed a scorched earth retreat across the Vistula River. Among the ruins of Königsberg, Allied intelligence later uncovered sealed steel containers welded shut and stamped with the codename Project Morgenlicht. Inside, according to fragmentary reports preserved in OSS cable traffic, were files describing experimental alloys designed to scatter and absorb radar frequencies. The language was technical, filled with references to Hohlraumstruktur, cavity structures, and Absorptionsschichten, absorption layers, terms eerily similar to those that would surface decades later in NATO stealth research. The discovery was not public. Instead, under the pretext of securing aeronautical records of minor interest, the US orchestrated Operation Luster in March 1945. Documents were removed in convoy trucks by the 39th Infantry Regiment and placed under OSS guard in Bremen before being flown to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. From there, the paper trail vanishes. No surviving shipping manifests, no official accession logs. A former Army Air Forces archivist, interviewed in 1967 under anonymity, recalled that crates labeled KM MOR 45 were sealed with lead solder and ordered never to be opened, without authorization from Washington. What little evidence exists comes from second-hand testimonies. A Soviet GRU after-action report dated July 12, 1945, described suicidal infiltration attempts by Red Army reconnaissance squads along the Vistula, targeting Allied convoys believed to be carrying Luftwaffe energy and invisibility research. One report listed 27 Soviet operatives unaccounted for after an ambush near Marienburg. Their disappearance, coupled with intercepted radio chatter referencing Nachtstahl, night steel, suggests Moscow was desperate to obtain whatever Morgenlicht represented. American engineers who later worked on radar-absorbent coatings for the Lockheed U-2 in the 1950s described being shown unattributed German formula sheets with chemical ratios for iron ferrets mixed into rubberized composites. One of them, Dr. Harold C. Kessler, gave a deposition to the Senate Armed Services Committee in 1974, stating, "We were told the notes were retrieved in Prussia. They predated anything we had by at least 15 years. His testimony was stricken from the final transcript. The disappearance of the Morgenlicht files from Pentagon archives occurred quietly. In 1951, the Air Material Command reclassified the project's accession number as destroyed by administrative error, yet an internal Air Force memo, uncovered in 1992 through a FOIA request, referenced Morgelt files moved to compartmented storage, Arlington, June 1951. Arlington National Records Center has no log of such a transfer. The files simply ceased to exist. The secrecy may have had less to do with technological advantage than with political liability. Britain's Air Ministry had been pursuing its own radar countermeasure programs under Sanche Operation Window, deploying aluminum chaff to blind enemy radar in 1943. If it were proven that Germany was already experimenting with physical absorption, materials questions would arise as to how the Allies missed the signal's intelligence. MI6 veterans have privately admitted that Enigma decrypts mentioning Morgenlicht were flagged as too speculative and never escalated. A darker interpretation exists. Soviet defectors claimed that Morgenlicht research was directly tied to underground facilities near Pillau, where forced laborers were used in experimental test chambers. Survivors of Stutthof concentration camp described being transported to sealed steel bunkers, where Luftwaffe technicians tested radar equipment on live prisoners, exposing them to high-frequency pulses. If these accounts are accurate, the captured files may have documented war crimes alongside scientific data, an explosive revelation during the Nuremberg trials, when the Allies were eager to portray their own intelligence as unimpeachable. The US government's silence has allowed speculation to thrive. Aviation historian Peter H. Sandberg, in his 1988 study, Ghost Projects of the Reich, argued that Morgenlicht directly influenced the development of the F-117 stealth fighter. He pointed out the uncanny similarity between a German schematic, labeled Flächenwinkel für Absorption, and a 1975 Lockheed design note on angular shaping. Sandberg's request to view the original document was denied. The National Archives replied that no record exists under the cited designation. What remains are fragments. A reference here, a code word there, testimonies half buried in censored transcripts. A declassified British intelligence file from 1946 includes a margin note by Group Captain Hugh Verney. The Americans have secured Morgenlicht. We must assume they will exploit exclusively. The handwriting is authentic. The E, ink faded. The file was stamped top secret, to be destroyed. Yet somehow it survived in an overlooked box. If the files were destroyed, they died with their secrets. If they survive, they remain locked in some classified vault, beyond public scrutiny. Either way, the implications are unsettling. That the foundations of modern stealth warfare may lie not in American innovation, but in a forgotten German project buried beneath the rubble of Königsberg. And that for reasons of politics, pride, or guilt, the truth was intentionally erased, leaving behind only whispers in the archive corridors. The mystery of Project Morgenlicht endures as one of the Cold War's most tantalizing shadows, a reminder that the real history of World War II was not always written for the public record, and that some battles were fought long after the guns fell silent, hidden in files we were never meant to see. On February 15, 1945, British Army engineers of the Royal Engineers 8th Field Company entered the gutted ruins of Dresden following the infamous firebombing. Beneath a collapsed section of a Krupp AG machining hall, buried in ash and twisted steel, they recovered a series of blueprint canisters stamped Scanma Geheime Reichssache, secret state matter. The drawings inside depicted a colossal artillery piece codenamed Sturmkanone, Sen, designed with a barrel length exceeding 40 meters and a firing chamber reinforced for chemical or nerve agent shells. The existence of such documents contradicted Allied intelligence assessments, which had believed Krupp had abandoned super artillery after the V3 program's failure. The canisters were quietly transferred under British custody to an improvised intelligence depot near Hanover. No public record of their seizure exists. Instead, the blueprints were placed into a black file within the War Office, referenced only in an internal memorandum dated March 3, 1945. Recovered ordnance designs of extraordinary caliber, strategic implications deemed destabilizing. The memo carried the initials of Major Charles Pennington, later assigned to Porton Down, Britain's chemical and biological warfare research facility. Witness testimony paints a troubling picture. An engineer named Ernst Krüger, interrogated at Camp 020 outside London, described Sturmkanone 9 as a Stadtvernichter, a city destroyer, designed to shell London or Paris with tabun-filled warheads from within German territory. Krüger claimed the prototype breach was completed at Krupp's Essen facility in late 1944, but the Allies' advance halted further assembly. His interrogation file, declassified in fragments in 1978, contains heavily redacted passages where Krüger apparently provided precise range estimates and chemical payload capacities. Why was this discovery never disclosed? Historians point to Britain's fragile public morale in early 1945. Having only just survived the V2 bombardments, the revelation of a new German superweapon capable of delivering mass chemical attacks would have risked widespread panic. It may also have undermined the Allies' narrative of imminent victory. Silence was politically expedient. The fate of the Sturmkanone blueprints remains a puzzle. In 1946, shipping manifests confirm that a wooden crate marked engineering, drawings, industrial machinery was delivered to Porton Down under sealed escort. What became of it afterward is unknown. Porton Down's own archive lists no such accession, and freedom of information requests have been denied on grounds of national security relevance. Former researchers interviewed decades later recalled seeing oversized ordnance schematics in storage, annotated with the name Krupp. One scientist, Dr. Lionel F. Rogers, claimed under anonymity in 1982 that chemical agent calculations in the files were uncomfortably precise and matched nerve gas dispersal equations still classified by NATO. The Soviets were not ignorant of these whispers. A GRU report from November 1946, intercepted by US Army Signal Intelligence Service, accused Britain of concealing German long-range gas artillery. The report suggested that captured Wehrmacht chemists were being coerced into continuing their research under British supervision. While unproven, such accusations fueled early Cold War distrust and shaped the Kremlin's belief that the West was weaponizing German science in secret. Perhaps most disturbing are the testimonies from former Dresden residents who recall Allied officers dismantling heavy steel frameworks in the days after the city's destruction. One local, interviewed in 1961, claimed he saw enormous circular mounts being loaded onto flatbed trucks at night, guarded by armed sentries with British insignia. No official record acknowledges the removal of such material. If true, it would imply that fragments of the Sturmkanone prototype were physically recovered and exported. By the 1950s, Britain had abandoned large artillery development, focusing instead on nuclear deterrence. Yet traces of Sturmkanone 9 linger. A declassified NATO report from 1963 includes a footnote describing legacy German ordnance design informing extreme-range gun research. The wording is vague, but researchers suspect it references SK9. At the same time, whispers of British scientists experimenting with hybrid rocket artillery systems in Wiltshire during the early Cold War persist, though evidence remains elusive. The legacy of Sturmkanone 9 is one of silence and shadows. No working prototype has ever surfaced. No official record admits its existence. Yet the consistency of the fragments, blueprint references, interrogation, files, eyewitness accounts, forms a troubling mosaic. It suggests that Germany came far closer to deploying a chemical superweapon than history books acknowledge, and that Britain may have deliberately buried the truth to preserve wartime morale and post-war stability. If the blueprints still exist, they lie buried in an archive box in Porton Down or some other classified repository, their contents too politically toxic to acknowledge. For the families of those who endured Dresden's firestorm, and for the millions who lived under the shadow of chemical warfare, the question lingers. What was hidden in those drawings, and how close did the world come to a final bombardment that never happened? In February 1944, Allied intelligence intercepted a series of Abwehr transmissions, referencing a heavily guarded rail convoy departing from the IG Farben complex near Krakow. The convoy, according to decrypted Enigma fragments, carried sealed, lead containers under SS supervision. The Office of Strategic Services, OSS, recognizing the potential link to nuclear material, initiated a joint mission with elements of the Polish Armia Krajowa. The plan was assigned the codename Operation Silver Ash, and tasked with intercepting the train before it reached German-controlled Silesia. Surviving mission outlines indicate that a combined force of 21 Polish resistance fighters and 6 OSS operatives assembled near Tarnow on March 6, 1944. They were equipped with explosives, silenced Sten guns, and demolition charges supplied through aerial drops under RAF Special Duties Command. Their orders: derail the convoy, seize the containers, and transfer them to an Allied-controlled extraction point south of Rzeszów. The mission would never be recorded in official histories. Within 2 weeks of its launch, every name attached to Silver Ash was marked missing. The story resurfaced decades later in declassified fragments. A British War Cabinet memo dated May 1944, mentioned a derailment attempt north of Krakow, but noted that no material evidence was recovered. An OSS after action file, uncovered in the US National Archives in 1998, references unsuccessful disruption, operatives presumed lost, train untraceable after March 7th. The train itself was never reported destroyed by the Germans, nor did any wreckage appear in Polish railway records. It was as though the convoy simply vanished. The Soviets, however, recorded something. An NKVD interrogation file from 1946 describes Polish partisans captured near Nowy Sącz, claiming they had participated in a failed ambush of a German death train carrying glowing cargo. The prisoners told their captors the lead containers emitted a humming vibration, and that two men who attempted to pry one open fell ill within hours, suffering burns on their hands and faces. Both allegedly died before the group dispersed. Soviet analysts concluded the containers may have held uranium oxide, a material central to Germany's stalled atomic program. Skeptics argue the descriptions could just as easily reference industrial, chemical stockpiles or nerve agents. Yet the secrecy surrounding the files remains telling. In 1951, when the CIA conducted an internal review of OSS operations, Silver Ash was flagged with the notation, "Details withheld, nuclear implications." No further documentation was released. Even the mission roster remains classified, though Polish archives confirm the disappearance of at least 3 resistance commanders in March 1944, whose names match the time and place. The operational silence appears deliberate. Publicly, Allied narratives of the war emphasized the failure of Nazi Germany to progress meaningfully toward a nuclear weapon. Acknowledging that Allied operatives risked their lives in an attempt to intercept suspected fissile material would have undermined this narrative. Worse, if the mission ended in disaster and the cargo reached Germany regardless, the episode would highlight a catastrophic intelligence failure. Erasure was easier than explanation. A few physical traces suggest the operation was real. In 1965, Polish railway workers unearthed a corroded steel plate near Bochnia, stamped with Reichsbahn inventory codes. Beneath it were fragments of charred wood and twisted rail spikes, consistent with an explosion. Locals recalled stories of a midnight battle in the nearby forest. Gunfire, a train halted, then silence. Yet no wreckage of the convoy itself was ever found. Some believe the Germans recovered and redirected it. Others suspect the containers were moved to underground facilities in Lower Silesia, never to be seen again. The broader implications are chilling. If Silver Ash failed to intercept uranium shipments, it raises the possibility that Germany's nuclear ambitions were further along than officially admitted. Historians note that by 1944, German scientists under Heisenberg had calculated enrichment pathways but lacked material. Was the convoy carrying ore extracted from Czechoslovak mines, bound for laboratories in Haigerloch, or was it simply another chemical transport, inflated by post-war paranoia? The lack of clarity has allowed conspiracy to thrive. In one of the last surviving references, a CIA memorandum from 1958 labeled "For DCI Eyes Only" includes a line stating, "Polish resistance Operation Silver Ash remains unresolved, operative losses unexplained, train cargo undetermined, recommend no disclosure." That recommendation has held. To this day, no government has acknowledged the mission's existence. What happened to the men who carried it out is another silence. Families of Armia Krajowa fighters reported their loved ones disappeared without burial. No graves, no death notices, only whispered warnings from neighbors that the Germans had erased them. For the 6 OSS operatives, not even names remain in official rosters. They were simply written out of history. The mystery of Silver Ash endures in classified margins and forgotten interrogations. Was it a desperate attempt to stop Nazi nuclear research, or a phantom mission inflated by Cold War secrecy? Until the missing convoy is found, or until hidden files surface from dusty archives, the fate of the glowing cargo and the men who tried to seize it will remain a ghost in the record, erased yet never fully gone. In May 1946, Soviet troops conducting demolition surveys in central Berlin discovered a reinforced sublevel beneath the ruins of the Reich Chancellery. The entrance had been sealed with concrete, the doorway hidden beneath collapsed masonry. Inside, according to an internal Soviet field report dated June 2, 1946, lay a long corridor lined with steel cabinets and soundproof chambers. Within those cabinets were reels of magnetic recording tape, each labeled with the insignia of the Abwehr and marked West Command. These were not operational orders or troop movements. They were recordings, allegedly intercepted Allied communications captured during the last years of the war. The report, signed by Colonel V.P. Morozov of the 3rd Shock Army, described the chamber as containing an archive of intercepted transmissions, some in English, some in coded French. Soviet signal specialists quickly realized that these were not ordinary intercepts. Several reels contained voices identified as belonging to British liaison officers, speaking in clear text about troop deployments and supply lines. If authentic, the tapes suggested the Germans had penetrated Allied communications far more effectively than declassified records ever acknowledged. More troubling, fragments of the collection hinted at possible double agents within British intelligence itself. What happened next remains shrouded in secrecy. According to testimony from a retired KGB archivist decades later, the chamber was sealed by direct order of Stalin himself. A demolition team was instructed to collapse the entrance and render the basement inaccessible. Only a handful of reels were removed, sent to Moscow under armed escort. The archivist claimed he personally handled 2 boxes of tapes stamped Abwehr, West Command 1943-44. What those reels contained and why they were never made public has been a matter of speculation for decades. The surviving fragments hint at extraordinary implications. A partially declassified Soviet intelligence assessment from 1947, preserved in the archives of the Russian Academy of Sciences, refers obliquely to recorded evidence implicating British command officers in unauthorized disclosures. A footnote adds, "Further exploitation deemed politically impractical." The wording is unusually cautious for Stalin-era documentation, suggesting the contents were explosive enough to risk destabilizing post-war alliances. British records from the period show signs of anxiety. In October 1946, MI6 circulated an internal memorandum titled "On the Matter of German Communications Archives," warning of unverified reports that Soviet authorities have obtained compromising materials. The memo emphasized the importance of denying all knowledge should such claims surface publicly. A handwritten note in the margin, attributed to Sir Stuart Menzies, chief of MI6, reads simply, "If true, this would be catastrophic." Historians have debated what the tapes might have revealed. One theory holds that they contained evidence of Allied deception operations, such as Operation Bodyguard, which, if misunderstood, could have been misconstrued as genuine collaboration. Another, more sinister interpretation suggests that one or more senior British officers may have been compromised, providing intelligence directly to German handlers. No names have ever been substantiated, though whispers of a London source appear in scattered Abwehr interrogation transcripts recovered by the Americans in 1945. Why would Stalin order the chamber destroyed if the material could discredit his Western allies? Some argue that the recordings may have implicated Soviet operatives as well, perhaps evidence of back-channel communications that Stalin preferred buried. Others suggest the tapes revealed that German intelligence had been more competent than previously admitted, a narrative Stalin could not allow to weaken Soviet prestige. There is also the practical consideration. Magnetic tape in the 1940s was fragile, and the technical means to authenticate or exploit it may have been limited. Rather than risk exposure, the Soviet leadership chose obliteration. The few reels that supposedly survived never resurfaced in official archives. During the 1980s, a West German researcher named Dieter Janssen claimed to have seen fragments of transcripts in the former Stasi files. He described passages where British voices discussed coastal convoy schedules, later targeted by U-boats. When Janssen attempted to publish his findings, East German authorities confiscated his notes. He died under unclear circumstances in 1989, days before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Even among Soviet veterans, the chamber is spoken of in hushed tones. General Sergei Kurov, interviewed in 1991, admitted, "We knew the Germans had something. We brought up the boxes. Then Moscow told us, no one will ever see this again." His statement was never elaborated upon. No physical trace of the chamber remains. The Reich Chancellery site was completely razed, its substructures obliterated in the 1950s during the construction of East German government buildings. What then did the Abwehr truly capture? Was it merely a collection of routine radio chatter, inflated into legend by Cold War secrecy? Or was it evidence that Allied communications were deeply compromised? Evidence so dangerous that both East and West agreed tacitly to bury it forever. The truth remains inaccessible, sealed beneath the rubble of Berlin and locked in archives that may never open. For now, the tapes exist only as a rumor echoed through classified margins, reels of voices from a war that should have ended, yet still hold the power to undermine the story we tell ourselves about loyalty, betrayal, and the fragile trust among nations after 1945. In the final weeks of the war, as Allied forces pushed into southern Germany, strange convoys were reported moving under the cover of night through the Black Forest region. Local villagers from Horb am Neckar recalled the sound of heavy trucks, rumbling along forest tracks, escorted by armored cars with headlights dimmed. These convoys, according to later testimonies, carried dismantled aircraft components removed from a concealed Messerschmitt testing facility. The project name whispered among survivors was PAM. Project Falk. The Falcon project, a rumored vertical ascent jet platform, unlike anything officially documented in German aviation. No Allied after-action reports from April 1945 mention the capture of such technology. Yet fragments survive in obscure references. A US Army Air Force's Intelligence Digest dated July 14, 1945, mentions aircraft prototypes retrieved, Black Forest sector, propulsion data consistent with advanced thrust vectoring design. The entry was struck through in red ink with the notation, retract, unconfirmed. Similarly, British Air Ministry correspondence from September 1945 refers to one Falk unit disassembled and removed under American escort. No further explanation was given. These scattered records suggest the existence of at least one experimental craft, dismantled before it could be destroyed by its designers. Rumors of the project's existence spread quickly in the post-war years. In 1952, a Soviet technical delegation accused the United States of stealing German skyweapon designs during interrogation sessions at Lubyanka prison. The allegation centered on the unexplained leap in American jet development between 1947 and 1950, culminating in the Bell X series experimental aircraft. Soviet engineers argued that the sudden appearance of advanced vertical thrust concepts in US test programs could not have emerged independently. Western officials dismissed these accusations as propaganda, but the timing was conspicuous. The most compelling clue comes from testimony given by Dr. Wilhelm Köhler, a Messerschmitt engineer captured by American forces and later resettled under Operation Paperclips. In a classified interview conducted at Wright Field in November 1946, Köhler described working on a compact interceptor capable of vertical launch from forest clearings. His account included sketches of a cylindrical fuselage fitted with 4 pivoting thrusters. Köhler insisted that only a single prototype was assembled, tested briefly near Stuttgart in late March 1945, and then dismantled as US forces advanced. The transcript of his interview was classified until 1999. Large sections remain redacted. Skeptics argue the story reflects little more than a conflation of desperate late-war German projects, many of which existed only on paper. Yet certain details are difficult to dismiss. In May 1945, engineers at Messerschmitt's Augsburg plant were interrogated by British intelligence. One, identified as Hans Oberst, claimed that a Falk design had been transferred to a hidden facility at Ehningen unter Achalm. He described its unique feature as Raketenstartfähigkeit, rocket launch capability. His statement was filed but never investigated further. Within weeks, Oberst was handed to American custody, and no further records of his debriefings exist. The absence of physical evidence is often cited as proof that Falk was myth, yet archival silences are themselves telling. In 1948, a joint Anglo-American review of captured German aviation files listed inconsistencies in the transfer of Messerschmitt technical papers. Several document numbers simply ceased to appear in later inventories. Among the missing were 2 files labeled Falk Aerodynamik and Falk Treibstoffsystem. The disappearance coincides with the relocation of German engineers to classified American programs. What might Project Falk have represented if real? Analysts suggest it could have been an embryonic forerunner of vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, VTOL, decades before the Harrier jet or American experimental platforms. If the Germans had indeed reached a working prototype, its seizure would explain both the United States' rapid leap in jet propulsion research and the Soviet Union's bitterness over being excluded from the find. At the same time, acknowledging such a discovery would have threatened to destabilize post-war cooperation, raising accusations of secret exploitation of Nazi technology. For the villagers of the Black Forest, memory fills where archives fall silent. Elderly residents interviewed in the 1960s recalled seeing a strange craft loaded in pieces onto Allied trucks. Some described it as shaped like a bullet with fins, others as a stubby rocket with wings. Their accounts, though imprecise, share a consistent theme. Something unusual was removed under extraordinary secrecy. One farmer claimed US soldiers threatened to shoot him if he approached the convoy. To this day, no official acknowledgement has been given. The silence surrounding Falk may have served a dual purpose. Beyond concealing technological exploitation, it erased any association with the forced labor used in Germany's secret aviation projects. Survivors from Dachau reported being transported to hidden workshops near Reutlingen, where they were compelled to machine experimental engine components under brutal conditions. Linking Falk to Allied aerospace advancements would have exposed a politically toxic truth: that progress in Cold War aviation was built in part upon the suffering of enslaved workers. Half a century later, the mystery remains unresolved. No wreckage has surfaced. No photographs have been authenticated. No documents declassified in full. Yet the convergence of fragmentary records, suppressed testimonies, and Cold War accusations forms a shadow narrative difficult to ignore. If Project Falk truly existed, it was buried deliberately, its remnants scattered into classified vaults, its story erased from public record. Perhaps the ultimate evidence lies not in what survives, but in what has vanished. Missing files, redacted transcripts, unexplained leaps in post-war technology. The Black Forest convoys may have carried more than wreckage. They may have carried the first fragile pieces of an aerospace future, stolen, in silence, hidden beneath the ashes of war, and never returned to history. What remains is not closure, but silence. A silence that suffocates archives, haunts testimonies, and stains the ground where secrets were buried. The war ended in fire, yet its echoes still breathe through vanished convoys, missing files, and experiments carved from human suffering. We are left only with fragments, enough to suggest the horror, never enough to prove it. Perhaps that was always the plan, to leave us staring into shadows where truth itself is forbidden.